Hello, I'm Dr. Cécile Cosculuela. Welcome to this ESL video on English grammar and more precisely on the passive voice. In this video, let's have a look at verb complementation because when you make sentences, you use words that belong to different categories, and it is important to know what categories exist and what their characteristics are. Which is why we have already worked on a general presentation, a general overview of the main grammar categories as regards sentences in general, or the noun phrase, and also pronouns, and also verbs. So that is the part we want to focus on more, because as you remember, there are different kinds of verbs. Some of them do not enable any transition towards an object, and they are called intransitive. Others can have an object, whether directly or indirectly, and some verbs can even have two objects, and in that case, they're called ditransitive verbs. So this last category is actually the one we want to focus on, but first of all, let's have a quick look at the question of verb complementation in general. It may also be called verb valency. Valency in linguistics regards the number of arguments, that is to say, important elements that play a part around the verb. So mainly it's the subject and the object or objects of the verb. Okay, so when a verb, and we're going to focus on that question and look at how things work relative to the active and passive voices. So the first point we're going to mention very quickly. The first point is monovalent verbs, verbs which have only one argument, that is to say, the subject. And in this category are intransitive verbs, so verbs that cannot have an object, qui ne peuvent pas avoir un complément. And they can only have a subject, so they are intransitive, and obviously they cannot be used in the passive voice. And other details should be mentioned, but it's not really the place here, because the only thing to remember is that monovalent verbs cannot be used in the passive voice. Let's go over quickly transitive verbs or divalent verbs. So verbs that have one subject and one object, so two arguments, which is why they are called divalent verbs. And among these verbs are the direct transitive verbs. So, for instance, in the sentence, somebody has eaten the cake, the structure, the syntactic structure is NP1, noun phrase number one, le groupe nominal numéro un, noun phrase number one, the subject, somebody in this case, and then the verb has eaten, and then noun phrase number two, the object, le complément, the cake. And this sentence, since in the active voice, we're in the active voice here, in the active voice there is an object which is direct and which can be used as the subject of the passive voice, and the passive voice will be the cake has been eaten. The agent may be mentioned as well by somebody. And then transitive verbs can also be indirect, in which case there is a preposition between the verb and the object. So an indirect transitive verb is the same thing as a prepositional verb. example, they paid, sorry, whoops, they paid for the meal. So the preposition here is for, and as you can see, they is NP1 and then the verb and then the preposition. So I'm following the syntactic structure here. And then NP2, noun phrase number 2, is the meal. So that's the object from which we can construct the passive voice sentence. The meal was paid for, and that's again the question of the preposition that it is absolutely necessary to mention at the end of the passive voice sentence or clause. We have already insisted on that key point. Make sure you remember to mention the preposition. So the main point of this video is to talk about ditransitive verbs. So verbs that have three arguments, the subject and two objects. Donc deux compléments. Let's translate a few examples. Le directeur donna une cravate au nouveau. So that's the active voice sentence, which in English is the head or the headmaster gave a tie to the new boy. The passive voice sentence can start with the object here, une cravate. Une cravate fut donnée au nouveau par le directeur. And in English, that would be exactly the same thing. A tie was given to the new boy by the head. Then it is also possible to switch the order of the objects. In French, le directeur donna au nouveau, which is now mentioned first instead of second, une cravate. And in English, it is possible to do exactly the same thing. The head gave the new boy a tie. Now, in French, it is not possible to make a passive voice sentence starting with the first object here, le nouveau. Le nouveau fut donné une cravate par le directeur is not possible, and that's what the asterisk here means. This sentence is not grammatically correct. Whereas in English, it is absolutely possible to make that passive voice sentence. It is correct to say the new boy was given a tie by the head. Okay, so what is possible in English is not in French, and that is one of the reasons why the passive form is used in more cases that in English than in French. But in French, it is possible to express the same kind of idea using different means. And for instance, this sentence, the last one here, can be translated into French by le nouveau se vit donner, se vit remettre une cravate par le directeur. So these examples are to be found in La grammaire explicative de l'anglais by Paul Larrea and Claude Rivière. Let's sum up the different points that we have just pointed out in the following table. So as regards ditransitive verbs, so verbs that have two objects, deux compléments, we need to remember that there are different types of verbs that we will use as models. So the first type of verb is going to use an indirect structure. So NP1 plus the verb plus NP2 plus the preposition, which is why it is indirect, and then a third noun phrase, un troisième groupe nominal. The second structure that is possible in the active voice is the direct structure. So we'll find a first noun phrase and then the verb, and then noun phrase number 3 because it appeared here in that indirect structure, and noun phrase number 2. We'll have examples in just a second. And in the passive voice, there are also two structures that are possible. The indirect structure, with NP2 as the subject, and the direct structure that starts with NP3 as subject. So let's have a look at the first verb that we're going to use as a model for all the other verbs that work the same way. So verbs like give can be used with either one of the two active voice structures and either one of the two passive voice structures. So it is possible to say, the head gave a tie to the new boy, in which we can see that NP1 is the head, the verb is gave, NP2, the second noun phrase, le second groupe nominal, a tie, and then the preposition, because we're in the indirect structure, so the preposition to, and the third noun phrase, the new boy. In the direct structure, since it is direct, there is no preposition, and we can say, for instance, the head gave the new boy a tie. In the passive voice now, we can first start with the first object of the indirect structure. So NP2, let's start with NP2 as a subject in the indirect structure. For the passive voice, a tie was given to the new boy. And it is obviously possible to also mention the agent by the head. And the direct structure is also possible with verbs like give in the passive voice. So let's start with NP3. As you remember, NP3 is the new boy. So the new boy was given a tie. And again, we may or may not mention the agent by the head. Okay, so some ditransitive verbs function like give, which we will memorize as a model for these verbs. Let's go on to the second type of ditransitive verbs. Let's have a look at the following example. Suzanne avait commandé un sandwich pour Fred. So the active voice would be Susan had ordered a sandwich for Fred, and we'll find exactly the same syntactic order and the same preposition here. And in the passive voice, un sandwich avait été commandé pour Fred, and that would be really the same thing in English. A sandwich had been ordered for Fred. How about switching the order of the objects? Suzanne avait commandé pour Fred, so let's put the second object in the right after the verb in this active sentence here, and switch the order of the objects. So Susan avait commandé pour Fred un sandwich. And in English, Susan had ordered Fred a sandwich. How about the passive voice? Fred avait été commandé un sandwich doesn't work in French, and it actually doesn't work in English either. Fred had been ordered a sandwich is not possible. So let's take the verb order as a model for all the verbs that only enable three structures with which it is only possible to use three of the four syntactic structures that we have here. So with the verb order, the two active voice structures are possible. We can say she had ordered a sandwich for Fred in direct structure, or she had ordered Fred a sandwich. And then the passive voice structures, only one of the two is possible. And we necessarily need to use a preposition in the structure for the passive voice. The sandwich had been ordered for Fred. Let's go on. The next example, il m'a expliqué la situation. Yes, the verb explain in English, we need to remember how it works because it's quite different from the French. So he explained the situation to me. And how about he explained me the situation, which resembles the French more than the first sentence in English? Well, that second sentence is not possible, okay? So we'll have to remember that there's only one possibility in the active voice, and it is the indirect structure, syntactic structure, the one with the preposition. You explain something to somebody. That's the only possibility. How about on m'a expliqué la situation. La situation m'a été expliquée. So again, we have on as a subject here. On m'a expliqué la situation. Do I have any idea of what that on refers to? No, I don't. It is really vague. So I know that in that case, I have to translate on by the passive voice, the formula of which is be plus ven. And so that's what I do here. The situation was explained to me. And again, I need to use the preposition here, the indirect syntactic structure. How about I was explained the situation without any preposition? Is that possible? Well, no, it is not. And more details are to be found in La grammaire explicative de l'anglais by Paul Lareya and Claude Rivière. Let's sum that up in the table here. So the third category of verbs we're looking at is the category for which only the two indirect structures are possible. In the active voice and in the passive voice, only the indirect structure is possible for verbs like explain. So explain always works with the preposition to. And as we can see in the examples here, the teacher explained the diagram to them, and there is no other possibility in the active voice. And in the passive voice, it's exactly the same thing, only the indirect structure with the preposition to is possible for verbs that function like explain. The diagram was explained to them. And again, in the passive voice, it is possible to mention the agent by the teacher. Last category, on lui a refusé un visa. In English, that would be he was refused a visa. So the passive voice here to translate on, because again, we do not know who that refers to. So since it is vague, be plus ven is our best option for the translation of the French pronoun. And the active voice would be they, for instance, refused him a visa. And that is actually the only possibility for verbs like refuse, as you will see in the grammaire explicative de l'anglais. And let's finish up this table on the different ways ditransitive verbs function. So with verbs like refuse, there is only one possibility for active voices, and it is to use the direct structure, the one that doesn't have a preposition. They refused him a visa, and it's the same thing in the passive voice. Only the structure without a preposition is possible. He was refused a visa. Okay, so give, order, explain, to, actually we could add here, same as here, and refuse can be the four models that we use to remember that ditransitive verbs do not all offer the same possibilities. Some of them can be used with either one of the four syntactic structures, some of them only three structures, and then some of them only the prepositional structure, and others only the structure that is without a preposition. More details. So, how about the following phrase? We paid no attention to his warnings. So the verb pay here is used with two different objects, no attention and his warnings. So is it possible to create a passive voice starting with his warnings, as in his warnings weren't paid attention to? And is it possible to start the sentence in the passive voice with no attention, as in no attention was paid to his warnings? Well, in this case, yes, indeed, these two passive voice sentences are correct. How about we had lost sight of the ship? So we could compare these two phrases, and here it looks like there are two objects, but in fact, sight is so associated to the verb that it is really difficult to separate them. Therefore, it is possible to make a passive voice starting with the ship. The ship had been lost sight of, and again, I make sure I use the preposition at the end of the sentence, just like here I had put to at the end of the sentence. And that is the only option for this last example here, which you can find again in Paul Laria and Claude Riviere's book. Okay, well, I guess that's it for now. In the next video, we'll go over the translation of more sentences from French into English, and we'll have a look at more difficult points. But for now, I guess that's it. So thank you very much for your attention. Keep on working, and I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, I wish you all the best.